Welcome to this online lecture for Western Civ 1. Today we're going to be talking about the birth of civilization. This is going to continue something that we started talking about in class. Now, as always, there are some key terms that you should keep in mind while you are watching this lecture. There's actually quite a few for this one, so keep track while you're going through. Also, there are some key questions that you should be able to answer by the time this lecture is over. So, without further ado, let's move on. So, what have we discussed so far? Well, one of the big points we have discussed is that there was a link between a change in climate, essentially the end of the Ice Age, and the development of agriculture. Agriculture ultimately led to the development of permanent cities, permanent settlements, and these permanent settlements then became the basis for civilization. Now, in this lecture, what we are going to discuss is some of the earliest civilizations, at least those that had an influence on Western civilization. We're also going to talk about how civilization changed humanity, how it changed human society. While agriculture developed in multiple places around the world, the one those of us interested in Western civilization typically focus on is Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is located in what is today Iraq and Syria. As the slide indicates, Mesopotamia means the land between the rivers, and those rivers were the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. Now, if you know anything about modern-day Iraq and Syria, you know that this land is not an ideal place for human habitation. The climate is very dry and desert-like. Yet the region was known in ancient times as the Fertile Crescent. Why? Appearances can be deceiving. While the area still is very dry, the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers made up for that lack of moisture. Those two rivers used to flood every year. These floods were destructive, wiping out cities, homes, and fields. But they did have one key advantage. Floods covered the ground with rich soil from the river bottoms, and that made the ground very, very fertile. Hence the name Fertile Crescent. Ancient civilizations also figured out ways to build dams that prevented the floods and provided irrigation for their fields. In fact, some archaeologists argue that it was the need for irrigation that led to the growth of the Mesopotamian civilizations. Irrigation is a major project that requires the building of dams and canals. But who were the people who first figured all this stuff out? To be honest, we probably don't know the identity of the earliest civilizations. But we do know something about the first of these civilizations who left behind a record of themselves. They are known as the Sumerians. The Sumerian culture arose around 3000 BCE in what is now southern Iraq. It was not a united empire or nation. Instead, the Sumerians lived in independent city-states. They traded with one another, and sometimes they fought wars with one another. We know this because Sumerian cities were surrounded by high walls with defense towers. Obviously, these people had something they wanted to protect. But the Sumerians were a clever people who had a major impact on Western civilization. Probably the biggest legacy is that they were one of the first civilizations to invent writing, which they did sometime around 3000 BCE. As farming became increasingly important to the Sumerians, they had to track what they were growing. Trade with other area civilizations was also important. The Sumerians traded their surplus grade for metals like copper and tin. They had to figure out some way to know how much grain they had to feed the population and how much they could afford to trade away. That need eventually was filled by writing. Scholars believe that writing developed out of a sort of picture writing. Scribes would carve these pictures or symbols, known as cuneiform, onto wet clay tablets. In other words, the first books. This slide includes an example of why writing was so important to agricultural peoples. Here is an excerpt from what we would call an agricultural almanac. Quote, "Keep your eye on the man who puts in the barley seed. Let him drop the grain uniformly 2 fingers deep. Use up 1 shekel for each garish. If the barley seed does not sink in properly, change the blade on your plow. All right, now, what does this tell us? Well, clearly, this tells us that they were writing down instructions for the proper planting of barley. Clearly, this was important. This was information they wanted to be able to pass on to other people. And because they were able to write it down, they were able to pass this information on. The growing importance of writing illustrates something else that will characterize Western civilization: an increasing stratification of society. Stratification means that the rough equality of hunter-gatherer cultures was giving way to a culture divided into nobility and peasant. That's because not everyone knew how to write. Early writing systems were very, very complicated. Someone had to be educated to learn how to read and write. Only the most important members of society were important enough to be educated. As civilizations grew in size and wealth, they also became targets of other peoples looking to take what they had achieved. This led to the development of government, and especially monarchy. Hunter-gatherer cultures had been led by a sort of council of elders, who sort of advised the people on what they should do. But remember, hunter-gatherer cultures were relatively equal. Everyone had a say. Now it was discovered that it was far more efficient to concentrate power in the hands of one strong military leader, what we would call today a king. Above is a mask of one of the first great kings in Western civilization. His name was Sargon of Akkad. So let's recap for just a second. Here are some of the features of civilization. There's agriculture. Agriculture leads to the need for writing. Writing creates social stratification. The need to control larger and larger societies led to the development of monarchy and government. Now let's add one more thing to this list. Neither the Sumerians nor any of the civilizations that followed them invented religion. The earliest hunter-gatherer tribes believed in beings greater than themselves. However, civilization does equal organized religion. What I mean by organized religion is an organized belief system that required an educated class of priests and religious leaders. Temples and worship spaces were also created. So why does civilization require organized religion? It relates to nature. The gods were thought to be in control of nature, and nature was critical to an agricultural society. You couldn't simply pick up your city and move just because of a long drought or destructive floods. Thus, to improve your odds, you needed to keep the gods that controlled nature happy. To do this, you created a group of priests who could organize worship and follow proper rituals to keep the gods satisfied. And if the gods were satisfied, life would be good. The earliest civilizations were therefore polytheistic. This means that they believed in more than one god. Typically, each part of the natural world was controlled by a different god. Notice the gods of the Babylonians, one of the civilizations that develops within the Fertile Crescent or Mesopotamia, above. Another key feature of these early organized religions revolves around the power of the priest. Remember, it was the job of the priests to keep their gods happy and content. If they did so, the god would bless them and make them prosper. It was an important job. Thus, huge resources within the city were dedicated to the temple. Priests were instructed in the rituals of sacrifice and worship. Not surprisingly, priests became rich and powerful. Sometimes, some priests were almost as powerful as the king himself. I hope this lecture has helped you see how civilization developed and how civilization changed humanity. Civilization led to the need for monarchy and government. It led to the need for keeping records and therefore writing. Writing led to the need for a stratified society, or not so much the need for, but the creation of a stratified society. And finally, organized religion also comes out of civilization because you've got to find some way to keep the gods happy because nature is so important to the survival of civilization. All right, well, that's it for this online lecture. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me or talk to me before class. Hey, thanks for listening.